The version of Threads you saw on television was nearly banned completely. You know the nuclear attack, but do you know about the real dead animals used as props, or the government pressure to censor the film as defeatist propaganda? Most fans don't realize the cast suffered psychological trauma for months after filming.
You cannot win a nuclear war!
And the BBC refused to air it again for 17 years. Today, we're uncovering 15 hidden truths about Threads, including an ending so devastating, a mother's silent scream at her stillborn child, that audiences sat in stunned silence for minutes after the credits ended. Let's get into it. 1. The invisible cast. To make Threads feel like a documentary rather than a drama, director Mick Jackson deliberately avoided casting famous actors or recognizable faces. He wanted audiences to see ordinary people who looked like their neighbors, their co-workers, their family members. The strategy worked too well. Because the actors were complete unknowns, many viewers who tuned in late to the BBC broadcast genuinely believed they were watching live news coverage of a real nuclear attack. There were localized panics across the UK as people called emergency services and neighbors, convinced that World War III had actually started. The BBC had to issue statements clarifying that Threads was fiction, but the damage was done. The film's realism was so convincing that it fooled people into thinking they were witnessing the end of civilization in real time. No traditional horror film could ever achieve that level of terror. 2. The shopping bag instinct. One of the most haunting images in Threads is a woman standing frozen in terror, urinating in fear while clutching a shopping bag as the nuclear flash lights up the sky. This wasn't just a random directorial choice meant to shock audiences. It was based on extensive psychological research into how people behave during extreme trauma. Studies of disaster survivors showed that humans instinctively cling to mundane, everyday objects as a way to psychologically anchor themselves when their entire world is collapsing. The shopping bag represents normalcy, routine, the life that existed 5 seconds ago before everything ended. It's a brilliantly observed detail that makes the moment feel authentic rather than theatrical. The woman isn't a character performing grief. She's a real person whose brain is desperately trying to maintain sanity by holding on to something familiar. That's not acting, that's psychology. 3. Real dead animals. Due to the film's minuscule budget, the production couldn't afford to create realistic charred animal props or use expensive special effects to simulate the aftermath of nuclear devastation. Instead, they sourced real animal carcasses from local butchers and scattered them across the sets. The smell of rotting meat under the hot studio lights was absolutely overpowering. Many actors and crew members had to wear masks between takes to avoid vomiting. Some people had to leave the set entirely because they couldn't handle the stench. The actors weren't pretending to be disgusted by the corpses littering the streets. They were genuinely sickened. That authentic horror shows in every frame. It's the kind of low-budget decision that accidentally created more realism than a $1 million effects budget ever could. 4. The serial fallout. The white radioactive ash that covers the survivors after the nuclear blast was created using a combination of flour, gypsum powder, and crushed puffed cereal. The mixture looked convincingly like fallout on camera, but it was incredibly irritating to the lungs and respiratory system. The actors spent weeks breathing in this dust during filming. Several cast members developed chronic coughs that lasted for months after production wrapped. There were no safety protocols or protective equipment. The actors just had to endure the constant exposure while performing scenes of physical and emotional collapse. The cast wasn't just acting exhausted and sick. They were genuinely struggling to breathe, genuinely covered in irritating powder, genuinely suffering in small but cumulative ways. The film's relentless sense of deterioration wasn't entirely fictional. 5. The banned sequel director Mick Jackson originally wanted to extend Threads beyond the immediate aftermath. He envisioned a final sequence showing the world 100 years after the blast, a devastated planet where civilization had regressed to pre-industrial barbarism. where language had devolved into grunts and fragments, where humanity had essentially reset to the Stone Age. The BBC refused to fund this extended epilogue. Network executives argued that the current ending, showing the de-evolution of language and the traumatized new generation born into hell, was already as much trauma as the human psyche could handle. They genuinely feared that pushing the horror any further would cause total psychological breakdowns in viewers, potentially trigger mass depression or even suicides. It's a fascinating case where a broadcaster censored a film not because of content violations, but because they believed it was too effective, too devastating, too psychologically dangerous to be shown in full. 6. Filmed in secret. To avoid interference from pro-nuclear political groups and conservative activists who might try to shut down production, much of Threads was filmed in Sheffield under a fake working title. The crew told local residents and businesses that they were making a historical drama about the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't until pyrotechnic tests for the nuclear blast sequences sent massive mushroom cloud effects into the sky that the city realized what was actually being filmed. By that point, production was too far advanced to stop. The deception created significant controversy. Some Sheffield residents felt betrayed and manipulated. Others were proud that their city had been chosen to represent the end of British civilization. The secrecy was necessary to get the film made, but it created resentment that lingered for years. 7. The hospital horror. The devastating hospital scenes showing overwhelmed medical staff trying to perform triage without supplies, electricity, or hope were filmed in the basement of an actual functioning hospital. The blood used in these sequences was a thick, sticky corn syrup mixture that attracted swarms of flies and insects, creating an additional layer of revulsion and chaos on set. Real doctors and nurses who visited the production or watched the finished film said that the depiction of medical collapse was the most accurate and terrifying aspect of the entire movie. The ethical nightmares of choosing who lives and who dies. The futility of trying to help when you have nothing to work with. Medical professionals recognize the scenarios as grimly realistic extrapolations of what would actually happen if hospitals were suddenly flooded with thousands of radiation victims and no infrastructure to help them. The fact that real medical experts vouched for the accuracy makes these scenes even more disturbing to watch. 8. Training with the war. The script for Threads was based on Exercise Square Leg, a secret British government war game from 1980 that simulated a full-scale Soviet nuclear strike on the United Kingdom. The writers had access to leaked classified documents showing the government's actual civil defense plans, including the famous Protect and Survive public information campaign that told citizens to hide under tables and paint their windows white to reflect thermal radiation. The leaked documents proved that the government knew these measures were completely useless. Casualties would be in the tens of millions no matter what civilians did. The film deliberately mocks the Protect and Survive guidelines by showing people following the instructions and dying anyway. It exposed the government's advice as theater, designed to give people false hope rather than genuine protection. A scathing political statement disguised as a disaster film. 9. The E.T. Connection Threads was filmed and released around the same time as lighthearted blockbusters like E.T., The Extraterrestrial, and Ghostbusters. The production designers deliberately used bright, cheerful, consumerist colors in the first half of the film. Vivid reds, blues, yellows, the saturated palette of 1980s advertising and television. The goal was to make the pre-war world look as normal and familiar as possible, so that when the nuclear blast happens and the film shifts to a desaturated gray-brown wasteland, it would feel like a physical assault on the viewer's eyes. The contrast between the colorful optimism of early 1980s Britain and the monochrome hell that follows is one of the film's most effective visual strategies. The death of color represents the death of civilization. Devastatingly effective. 10. Psychological trauma for the cast. Karen Meager, who played the lead character Ruth, later admitted in interviews that she struggled to return to normal life after filming Wrapped. living in a post-apocalyptic mindset for months, pretending every day that civilization had collapsed, that food and water were precious miracles, and that death was everywhere, fundamentally changed how she saw the world. She developed a period of deep depression where she couldn't take basic comforts like clean water, electricity, or fresh bread for granted anymore. Everything felt fragile and temporary, like it could be destroyed at any moment. Other cast members reported similar psychological effects. They described Threads as the most emotionally punishing project they'd ever worked on. The film didn't just affect audiences, it broke the people who made it, leaving them with a darkness they couldn't completely shake even decades later. 11. The 17-year ban. After its initial broadcast in September 1984, Threads was so controversial and psychologically devastating that the BBC refused to air it again for 17 years. It essentially became a ghost film, or banned not through official censorship, but through institutional fear of its power. The only way to see it was through bootleg VHS tapes that circulated among people who wanted to prove to their friends that the scariest movie ever made actually existed. It became an underground legend, whispered about in the same tones as banned horror films or snuff films, except this was broadcast on national television and endorsed by the government. When the BBC finally re-aired it in 2003, nearly 2 decades after its debut, it had lost none of its power to horrify. The 17-year absence only added to its mythological status. The film too disturbing to show. 12. The rat scene. The scene where a starving survivor catches and eats a raw rat is one of the most viscerally disturbing moments in the film. The rat itself was a prop, but the blood and viscera visible in the actor's mouth were real animal organs provided by the butcher who supplied the carcasses for other scenes. The actor was so committed to selling the horror of the moment that he actually bit into the prop with enough force to cut his own gums. His real blood mixed with the animal blood, creating an unintentionally authentic layer of gore. It's a moment of shocking degradation that shows how far humanity has fallen. From a civilized society to people eating vermin raw because there's no other food and no way to cook it, the scene is barely watchable. That's precisely the point. 13. Predicting nuclear winter threads was one of the first major films to accurately visualize the concept of nuclear winter. The theory, massive fires from nuclear explosions, would inject so much smoke and ash into the atmosphere that it would block out the sun for months or years, causing global crop failure and mass starvation. Director Mick Jackson consulted with scientists, including Carl Sagan, to ensure that the depiction of the sky darkening and temperatures plummeting was based on actual scientific models rather than dramatic exaggeration. The film shows crops dying, livestock freezing, the surviving population slowly starving because nothing will grow in the perpetual twilight. This wasn't science fiction. It was the scientific consensus of what would actually happen. So Threads helped popularize the nuclear winter theory and made it a central part of the public discourse around nuclear weapons. Realistic science is more terrifying than any fantasy. 14. The BBC Censorship Battle. The BBC faced immense pressure from the British government to cancel the broadcast of Threads before it ever reached the public. High-ranking officials in the Thatcher administration argued that the film was defeatist propaganda, that it would undermine public support for Britain's nuclear deterrent and help the Soviet Union by making British citizens too terrified to support defense spending. There were genuine attempts to kill the project or force the BBC to shelve it indefinitely. The BBC only managed to air Threads by framing it as a public service announcement about civil defense rather than entertainment. They were forced to include a live panel discussion immediately after the broadcast to provide balance and mitigate the film's devastating anti-war message. The government wanted reassurance and optimism. The BBC gave them the apocalypse instead. It became one of the most significant acts of journalistic courage in British broadcasting history. 15. The ending that broke the audience. The final shot of Threads, A young woman giving birth in squalor, looking at her stillborn or horribly deformed child and screaming in silent anguish, was almost cut from the film for being too extreme. Studio executives wanted a glimmer of hope, some suggestion that humanity might eventually recover. Director Mick Jackson argued that in a true nuclear exchange there is no hope, no recovery, no happy ending, and the human species would be permanently damaged genetically and psychologically, and any children born into that world would be born into hell. The ending is widely cited as the most traumatizing cut to black in cinema history. When Threads premiered in 1984, audiences sat in total, stunned silence for minutes after the credits finished rolling. People didn't move, didn't speak, didn't applaud. They just sat there, broken, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. It's an ending that stays with you forever. If you were one of the people who saw it in 1984 and never forgot it, let me know in the comments. If you want more deep dives into the films that weren't afraid to show the end of everything, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.